Hello, and welcome to this webinar from the Fieldfisher Silicon Valley team on changes to European cybersecurity laws. My name is Robert Fett, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Paul Lanois and James Russell. We're going to be highlighting some practical action points today about a number of new pieces of legislation popping up in Europe and how they may affect you, your vendors, and customers. The EU has a particular focus on cybersecurity at the moment as a result of the increasing number of cyber attacks and their impact on our day-to-day lives. That's why it's expanding existing legislation to cover a wider range of sectors thought to be strategic, because any disruption could cause damaging effects on the economy and essential services. There have been some well-known cyber incidents that have affected banks, hotels, communications, hospitals, the transport sector, and of course the cloud vendors that provide services to support those industries. There have also been increasing political tensions around the world, which make the prospect of cyber attacks an increased reality. And now the EU has decided that everybody needs to step up to play their part. Although there are a number of pieces of legislation popping up, the primary focus of today will be on the NIS2 directive, but we'll also briefly touch on some others. Next slide, please. So why have we chosen to focus on NIS2 and what is it all about? NIS stands for Network and Information Systems. The number 2 reflects the fact that it replaces the NIS directive of 2016, which had more limited scope, affected fewer industries, and left penalties to each member state to decide upon. NIS2, on the other hand, sets down more stringent penalties and enforcement measures to be applied consistently across each member state. So you can see from our slide here, the penalties could be up to either 10 million euros or 2% of annual turnover. That applies to essential entities, whereas important entities are liable for up to 7 million or 1.4%. We'll come on to discuss what is meant by essential and important entities later. There are some other legislative acts, SIR and DORA, which Paul will go into later. These are more focused in their application, whereas NIS2 is more wide-reaching, and that's why we're going to focus on NIS2 today. But before we kick off, let's have a quick interactive poll to understand how much work our audience have put in to date on NIS2. James? So, have you already started compliance work for the EU's security regulation framework? Let's have your votes, please. And let's check out the results. So interesting, pretty balanced. I've got a mix of some people not starting at all, some people thinking about it, and some making a little bit of progress, but unsurprisingly, nobody has made any significant progress yet. So let's go on to our agenda. So first of all, Paul is going to lead us through the EU's framework for cybersecurity, followed by James, who will do a deep dive on which entities NIS2 applies to. I'll then return to talk about some of the key practical implications you need to be aware of that could result in changes compared to your current practices, assuming you're already complying with GDPR. Watch out, there's going to be another fun quiz later. Paul will then talk about timelines for compliance before James wraps up with some key takeaways and next steps. So without further ado, let's crack on. Paul, it's over to you.
Thanks, Rob. So there has been a lot of focus on cybersecurity strategy lately. For example, if we look at the United States, President Biden issued on 21st March 2022 a statement titled Statement on Our Nation's Cybersecurity, urging private sectors, organizations to harden their cyber defenses by implementing the best practices. More recently, the White House released on March 2nd, 2023, its National Cybersecurity Strategy, which offers significant changes in how the United States allocates roles, responsibilities, and resources in cyberspace. So there's a lot to unpack there, but we will be focusing today on the European Cybersecurity Framework. The European Commission had announced in its Work Programme 2020 that it would review the European Cybersecurity Strategy and legislative framework by the end of 2020. And so on 16 December 2020, the European Commission released its EU Cybersecurity Strategy, which includes updates to a key piece of legislation, a proposal for a directive on measures for a high common level of cybersecurity across the Union, which became the NIS2 directive. Next slide, please. So in order to strengthen the European cybersecurity framework, the EU introduced a set of tax relating to cybersecurity. The first tax is the new EU Critical Entities Resilience Directive, also called the CER Directive, which is aimed at strengthening the resilience of so-called critical infrastructure. It covers 11 critical sectors such as energy, transport, financial market infrastructures, and digital infrastructure, and is intended to address specific threats, including natural hazards, terrorist attacks, insider threats, and sabotage. Next slide, please. So the second tax is the EU Digital Operational Resilience Act, commonly called DORA. So no connection whatsoever with Dora the Explorer, sorry. DORA is aimed at harmonizing cybersecurity and resilience of IT systems used by the financial services industry. So before DORA, financial institutions manage the main categories of operational risk, mainly with the allocation of capital, but they did not manage all components of operational resilience. Entities covered by DORA include a wide range of financial entities, including credit institutions, electronic money institutions, investment firms, insurance undertakings, and reinsurance undertakings. After DORA, these entities must also follow rules for the protection, detection, containment, recovery, and repair capabilities against ICT-related incidents. Next slide, please. So you have those two tags which I just mentioned, which are intended to sit alongside NIS. And the first NIS directive was the first piece of EU-wide cybersecurity legislation, and it was aimed at enhancing cybersecurity by creating a common security standard, favoring cooperation among EU member states, and imposing additional cyber-related obligations to providers of specific critical services with a view of ensuring a continuity of services in the EU. So the United Kingdom implemented NIS into its own national law through the UK NIS regulations. Although the NIS1 directive was considered an essential component of the EU's level of cyber resilience, it revealed a number of shortcomings, including a significant divergence in EU member state implementation of the NIS1 directive, which ultimately led to a fragmented legal framework and protection in terms of cybersecurity, and that in turn caused the EU to adopt a successor law, the NIS2 directive. Next slide, please. So the NIS2 directive would therefore take the place of the existing NIS directive. The NIS2 directive is part of the EU's new digital legislative package, which is aimed at making Europe fit for the digital age, as they call it, and which also includes, for example, the EU's proposed Cyber Solidarity Act and the Cyber Resilience Act. So if we look at the EU Cyber Solidarity Act, it aims to strengthen capacities in the EU to detect, prepare for, and respond to significant and large-scale cybersecurity threats and attacks. It includes what they call a European Cybersecurity Shield, made of security operation centers interconnected across the EU, and a comprehensive cybersecurity emergency mechanism to improve the EU cyber posture. It would also create an EU cybersecurity reserve with incident response services from trusted providers which are ready to intervene at the request of a member state in case of a significant and large-scale cybersecurity incident. It would also provide financial support for mutual assistance between member states' national authorities. The second act, the Cyber Resilience Act, aims to safeguard consumers and businesses which are buying or using products or software with a digital component. The Cyber Resilience Act would introduce mandatory cybersecurity requirements for manufacturers and retailers of such products, with this protection extending throughout the product life cycle. So the Cyber Resilience Act would also impose liability for bringing vulnerable products to market. The NIS2 directive won't apply to the UK directly, of course, due to Brexit, but the UK government is currently reviewing the effectiveness of the UK NIS regulations, and new legislation is expected to expand its scope and to increase existing incident reporting duties. So this is an area to watch for future developments. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. So now that we've kind of got ourselves situated a little bit, I think that the next thing that most people on this call are probably thinking is, okay, but what does this mean for me? Does the directive actually apply to me, and what do I need to do about it? So if we flip on to this next slide, here we're trying to visualize the scope of the provisions under Article 3 and Article 2 of the NIS2 directive, which basically answers the question, are you impacted? So unlike under NIS1, where the determinative criteria were set by member states, under NIS2, the EU is trying to establish some harmonized definitions across the board. Broadly speaking, these can be divided into 4 categories, as you can see on the slide. So starting with that biggest one in the middle, the broadest category is basically all about size. So naturally, as you can see in the middle, you have to provide services or be carrying out services in the EU. So much, so little surprise. But beyond this, all you need to do to fall in NIS2 is firstly, fall in the list of sectors. And we're going to just see on the next slide how that's been expanded quite a bit. And secondly, you need to fall under certain size thresholds. And those thresholds are set out in the Commission recommendations on SMEs. But in short, and we got a quiz later, so I'd recommend taking a note of this one. The numbers that you're looking at can be as low as 50 employees and either turnover or a balance sheet over 10 million euros. So 50 employees or balance sheet / turnover of 10 million euros. And as promised, on this next slide, here we've got a breakdown of all of the relevant sectors. So the ones on the left shouldn't be particularly surprising. Those are all just ones that we are familiar with under NIS1. But the keys to sort of take a note of are those on the right-hand side, because over there you'll see that, as I mentioned, we've significantly expanded these. So there's a lot of people who previously didn't really need to worry about this that now need to be thinking about their compliance obligations again. And there's quite a few on that list. All right, but coming back to our big categories, the 3 other categories that we've listed underneath the big one, these are ones that you might fall into regardless of size. And they're a bit more niche and they're a bit more specialized, which is why we've kind of put them down underneath. But starting with the second category, this includes public administration entities that provide electronic communication networks. So that's our PECNs. Publicly available electronic communication services, that's our PESCs. In there, we've also got trust services, top-level domain name registries, that's our TLDs, and also domain name systems, DNSs. So if you're in this category, you probably already know who you are, and that the same applies to our third category, which is the domain name registration services, as compared to our domain name systems. Lots of similar terminology here, but the point is you probably know who you are if you fall into those categories. Finally, we have those entities which identified as critical under the Critical Infrastructure Directive, which Paul was just talking to us about a moment ago. As we've already mentioned, the latter has already been adopted last year, and it's mainly focused on physical resilience. But the point is that it leaves the task of enumerating that list of digital providers as well to member states, and the deadline is the same as under NIS2. So watch this space. And then, yeah, as Rob was promising earlier, within those entities which are caught by the directive, so if you now know that you probably are going to be caught, there's this distinction that's worth flagging about whether you fall into the bucket of essential entities or important entities. So essential entities, as we can see on the left-hand side of the slide, are entities which were previously what you might think of as operators of essential services under NIS1. Like if you were in that bucket under NIS1, you're still in that bucket under NIS2. But it also includes those entities which satisfy higher size thresholds. So again, here's some numbers for you. If you're employing over 250 people, or you have an annual turnover over 50 million euros, and here it gets a bit tricky, or a balance sheet over 43 million euros, then you're caught in this bigger, more demanding essential entities bucket. Basically, everything else that's in scope that doesn't fall within the essential entities falls back within that alternative bucket of important entities. But in both cases, it's also just worth emphasizing that these are subject to a national risk assessment. And some of the criteria which falls on that list are things like, are you the sole provider in that member state of essential services for the maintenance of critical societal or economic activities? That's Article 22b. Would disruption to your service have a significant impact on public safety, public security, or public health? That's 2c. Would disruption to your service induce a significant systemic risk, which could have a cross-border impact? That's 2d. And finally, is it critical for some other specific important region at a national level or regional level for the particular sector that you're in? That's Article 2e. So just some things to think about that might be included in those member state risk assessments. Okay, so now we have an idea of who is included. We thought we'd make it a bit more interactive and a bit more concrete on what does this actually look like in practice. So on the slide, we've set out two hypothetical examples of companies which might fall within the scope of the directive or who might be impacted by NIS2. So Stay Fair is an online furniture marketplace. They have 249 employees. They have 42 million euros in turnover, and they provide services to customers in Germany. So for our categorization purposes, they are a digital service provider. And if we can then have a look at OMG Cloud, they are a cloud computing company. They got 50 employees and 12 million euros worth of server equipment. They've got a customer in France, and they are mainly focused on digital infrastructure. So our quiz question, as none of you will be surprised, is which of these will be caught by NIS2? If I can just launch that poll, hopefully you can all see that now. Let's see what you think. Is it neither? Is it Stay Fair only? Is it OMG Cloud only, or is it both? What do we think? We're getting a mixture of responses. Do plug in a suggestion and see what you think. It'd be useful to hear what people's thoughts are. Okay, I think we've got a good range of responses now. Let's close the poll, and I'll share those results so you can have a look what people thought. As I said, bit of a spread. Some people thought it was just Stay Fair. Some people thought it was just OMG Cloud. Some people thought it was both. And if we come back to our slides, though, the answer is it's both. So both are on our expanded list of covered sectors. Both are providing services to customers in Europe, so no surprise there. We can tick both of those boxes immediately. If you didn't catch it before, though, the key here is those size thresholds about being in scope. So rather than whether or not you're in the narrow essential entities category, the key is to be caught at all, you just need 50 employees and 10 million euros in revenue or turnover on the balance sheet. So even if they're operating at a loss, even if things are going terribly, if they've got 12 million on their balance sheet, that's enough to be caught for OMG Cloud as well as Stay Fair. All right, let's try another set of examples. So this slide might be even a little trickier. Here we're looking at what happens when you look down the contract chain. So at the top, we have PostX. We aren't providing numbers on this one, so don't worry too much about the figures, but we are told this is rapidly becoming one of Belgium's largest courier services. Second, we have Datablocks, one of PostX's suppliers that provide them with data storage facilities. And further down the chain still, we have WorkPlay, one of Datablocks' suppliers, in this case providing HR and payroll services. So our question is, which of these are going to need to consider NIS2 provisions in their contracts? And let me see if I can just pull that up for you guys. There we go. So which of these need to consider NIS2 provision in their contracts? Is it none of them? And again, we're assuming numbers for this one, so don't worry too much about the numbers. But is it none of them? Is it only PostX? Is it PostX and data blocks? Or is it all three, PostX, data blocks, and workplay? What do you think? Ooh, again, a bit of a mix of responses. I'll just leave it a minute or two in case people are still biting their nails. Okay, I think we got a good range of responses now. I will close the poll and share the results for you. So as we can see, some people thought it was just PostX and data blocks. Some people thought it was all three. I think some people are cottoning on to the theme of the presentation today. But if we go back to our slides, I will give us our results. And again, it's everybody. So PostX falls under one of our new sectors because they're involved in mail and courier services. So no surprises there that they're in scope, and we need to think about NIS2 for them. Data blocks does get more tricky, as you might wonder whether they fall within our in-scope categories, and maybe we need more detail about those numbers. But I'd say, again, assuming that we've got the details of the numbers, they're nevertheless likely to be a managed service provider in their own right. And therefore, they're probably going to have registration responsibilities under Article 27 of the directive. And then finally, and this is the one which divided you guys on the call, workplay. You may have thought that they don't need to think about this. And to some extent, you are right, because they wouldn't be directly caught by the directive. But our question was, who is impacted? Who needs to think about this in their contracts? And the key to remember here is that even if workplay are not themselves caught by the directive, the companies above them in the chain are likely going to need to flow down their responsibilities. So particular one to think about is Article 21(2)(d) has supply chain security measures. So those are things that people are going to want to flow down. Now, just as a little aside here, some of you might have seen the recent news about BA, Boots, and the BBC. And what's noticeable about those is that they were hacked using an exploit of a vulnerability in a piece of file transfer software, which was accessing HR data. So believe it or not, we did actually design this question before the news, but it really highlights the fact that companies at all levels are going to be wanting to review security across their entire software supply chain. So these NIS2 requirements are almost certainly going to get flowed down. Okay, so I have hammered you over the head with the fact that it's possible that your business is going to be caught by the directive, even if it wasn't before. So Rob, if our friends on the call are caught, what are the key changes under the directive that they should be thinking about?
Thank you, James. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at what's the key changes under NIS2. So next slide, please. So I'm going to be assuming that most of you listening today are currently already meeting GDPR requirements. And if that's the case, you're partway there, but there are definitely some things to watch out for. So let's first talk about enforcement. The good news here is that the maximum level of fines under NIS2 is less than under GDPR, but it's still pretty significant. If you're an essential entity, then fines can reach a maximum of 10 million euros or 2% of annual worldwide turnover, whichever is higher. And if you are an important entity, then that's 7 million euros or 1.4%. But it's not just about fines. Competent authorities will have some broad enforcement powers. These can include carrying out inspections, security scans and audits, requesting information, issuing warnings about infringing entities, and issuing compliance orders. For essential entities, it can also include an order to designate a monitoring officer to oversee compliance. And this too covers a wide variety of measures, including various forms of cooperation with authorities and industry partners to increase awareness of risk and share prevention strategies. These are definitely worth understanding, but for now we'll focus on the key practical measures that you need to consider. And first up is updating your incident response policies, procedures, and reporting lines. Now, before we go on to the details, let's have another poll. Do you think that the EU has been kind to us and appreciated how difficult it is to comply with the current 72-hour deadline for notification under GDPR? Or do you think they have been a little bit mean? So is the notification period going to be longer than GDPR? That means more than 72 hours. Is it going to be the same as GDPR, or is it going to be less than GDPR? We'll give you a few seconds to choose your response. And let's take a look at the results. Ooh, so people were optimistic. They thought 72 hours, right. Well, let's continue. So I'll tell you the answer in a little bit. So updating your instant response policies is going to be critical to meeting the heightened notification timelines under NIS 2. If you thought that 72-hour notification was difficult under GDPR, I think you should probably sit down if you're not already and take a deep breath, because under NIS 2, an initial report must be made without undue delay and in any event within 24 hours of becoming aware of the significant incident. That's 24 hours. And as we know, incidents always seem to happen on a Friday, so you won't even have the weekend to think about it. And if that wasn't enough, NIS 2 also requires follow-up reports within 72 hours and final reports within 1 month. So there's quite a few different requirements compared to GDPR, and that's why it's important to keep those policies up to date. But wait, I haven't quite finished on this. So if you've been subject to a breach before, you'll no doubt have experienced those lengthy debates about whether a breach involves personal data. Now, do you want the good news? Well, you won't have to have that debate under NIS 2. Perhaps the bad news is that the standard for notification under NIS 2 is all about whether the breach is a significant incident. And what is a significant incident? A significant incident has nothing to do with the definition of personal data, really, or perhaps even any data at all. An incident is significant if it has caused or is capable of causing severe operational disruption of the services or financial loss for the entity concerned, or if it is affected or capable of affecting other natural or legal persons, aka your customers, by causing considerable material or non-material damage. So that's a much broader definition than under GDPR. So the next item on your agenda for preparing for NIS 2 should be updating your customer and vendor agreements. And of course, like GDPR, don't be surprised if you receive updates from your customers and vendors for you to review and agree to. That was kind of what James was alluding to in our slides before. This part of the legislation is about ensuring that your vendors can demonstrate cyber resilience and that you are flowing down your own requirements and those of your customers to your vendors. And of course, you'll probably want to prepare some materials so that you can adequately respond to your customers about that compliance. So cue the receipt of some hideously long security questionnaires unless you have some sort of prepared materials ready to go. The final topic I want to mention is management body liability. So such bodies, i.e. the board of your company, must ensure that they approve the cybersecurity risk management measures and oversee its implementation. And significantly, under departure from GDPR, the management bodies can be held liable for infringements. Also, in the case of essential entities, competent authorities can impose a temporary prohibition on the exercise of managerial functions. The exact details of this liability will actually have to wait for member state legislation to be published. So far, there's been a draft from Germany, so we're still waiting for quite a bit of member state legislation to come out. And finally, these management bodies will need to undergo training and also encourage training to their employees on a regular basis to identify and assess risks. There are, of course, a number of other considerations in NIS 2 and other action items which we don't have time to touch on today. There's a lot to consider, and Paul is now going to take us through sort of how you put together an action plan and what the timeline looks like.
Thanks, Rob. So as you mentioned, there are a bunch of considerations that will need to be analyzed and implemented. For example, NIS 2 also requires covered entities to put in place a list of risk management measures, which should, according to NIS 2, at the minimum include the following: risk analysis and information system security policies, incident handling, business continuity such as backup management and discovery recovery, crisis management, supply chain security, including security-related aspects concerning the relationships between each entity and its direct suppliers or service providers, security in the network and information systems acquisition, development and maintenance, including vulnerability handling and disclosure, basic computer hygiene practices and cybersecurity training, policies and procedures regarding the use of cryptography and where appropriate encryption, human resources security, access control policies, asset management, the use of multi-factor authentication or continuous authentication solutions, and so on. So, as you can see, that there is really quite a bit to be done if we look at the cybersecurity risk management alone, and we have not even covered the other topics that are covered by the NIS2 directive. So it will likely take quite a bit of time to review the existing practices, to identify potential gaps, and implement the required measures. So it's really best to start working on this sooner rather than later. Next slide, please. So if we, so this is the time frame that we propose for NIS2 preparedness. So you should start now actually to review and understand the requirements of NIS2 if you haven't already. Start by reviewing if you are covered by NIS2, look at the activities your organization is conducting, look at whether you may be impacted by NIS2 due to being a supplier or a service provider of a covered entity and so forth. And once you have done that, the next step would be analyze, look at if NIS2 is applicable or has an impact on your organization, and for that, determine in which category your organization would fall into, what are the requirements that would apply in that case. So this step would also help you to inform any budget planning for implementation, which you would have to look into implementing during Q1 to Q3 of 2024. So that would be the preparation stage, sorry. And national governments will have to introduce national legislation to reflect the obligations of the NIS2 directive with a deadline of 17 October 2024 for adoption. So if you think that, oh, once we can wait till the national laws come out so that we can start looking at what we need to do, that would be a mistake, because NIS2 for the states that its measures apply from 18 October 2024. So this is why organizations should not wait too long before assessing compliance with NIS2. Don't wait till 17 October because you won't have time to do everything in one day, obviously. And as a result, many organizations are looking into NIS2 compliance now in order to be ready for that 18 October 2024 deadline. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. So we're conscious that we covered quite a lot today, and therefore it might just be worth recapping some of the key points before we let you go. So first of all, as Paul has just been saying, I think the really one big takeaway is that the deadline for compliance might seem far away, but October 2024 is actually quite soon when you think about all the changes that you might need to implement once you've identified what's necessary. So yeah, the deadline is not far. Get started now is sort of takeaway number one. Takeaway number two then is that the top priority at this stage should really be about reviewing whether and in what way the directive could be relevant to you so that you can put together a plan for appropriately implementing any changes that might be required going forward. And finally, as our third key takeaway, it's important to remember that those changes could involve quite extensive updates to systems like your instant reporting procedures, your contractual arrangements with customers and vendors, and so on. So it'll be important to take stock now of how significantly your compliance program might need to change. But I think with that, it's about a wrap. So thanks everybody for tuning in to listen to us today. And to those of us who have been replying to your polls, thank you very much for your contributions. We appreciate the engagement. And for those of you who have been submitting questions in our chat function, thank you as well for those. If we haven't already had a chance to answer your questions as we've gone along, I think there might have been one or two that we've responded to already. We'll try to follow up with you about those offline. But equally, if you have a question just now that you've only realized that you want to ask, do of course reach out to us using the details on screen, and we'd be very happy to get back to you. Thank you very much for attending again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.